Extortion, pitiless extortion, is making havoc in the land. We are devouring each other. With full barns, puts the bounties of Providence under bolts and bars, waiting with eager longings for higher prices. The greed of grain stalks among us unabashed by the heroic sacrifice of our women or the gallant deeds of our soldiers. Speculation in salt and bread and meat runs riot in defiance of the thunders of the pulpit and executive interference and the horrors of threatened famine. In 1864, the government found that quantities of grain paid in under the tax as new grown were mildewed. It was grain of the previous year which speculators had held too long and now palmed off on the government to supply the army. Amid these desperate conditions, the fate of soldiers' families became everywhere a tragedy. Unless the soldier was a landowner, his family was all but helpless. With a depreciated currency and exaggerated prices, his pay, whatever his rank, was too little to count in providing for his dependents. Local charity dealt out by state and county boards, by relief associations, and by the generosity of neighbors, formed the barrier between his family and starvation. The landless soldier with a family at home in desperate straits is too often overlooked when unimaginative people heap up the statistics of desertion in the latter half of the war. It was in this period, too, that amid the terrible shrinkage of the defensive lines, refugeeing became a feature of Southern life. From the districts over which the waves of war rolled back and forth, helpless family, women, children, slaves, found precarious safety together with great hardship by withdrawing to remote places which invasion was little likely to reach. An odyssey of hard travel, often by night and half secret, is part of the war tradition of thousands of Southern families. And here, as always, the heroic woman, smiling, are the center of the picture. Their flight to preserve their children was no small test of courage. Almost inevitably, they had to traverse desolate country with few attendants through forest and across rivers where the arm of the law was now powerless to protect them. Outlaws defiant of the authorities, both civil and military, ruthless men of whom we shall hear again. Those men roved the great unoccupied spaces so characteristic of the Southern countryside. Many a family legend preserves still the scene of breathless caution of pilgrims in the nighttime intensely silent for fear of these masterless men. When the remote rendezvous had been reached, there a colony of refugees drew together in a steadfast despair, unprotected by their own fighting men. What strange, sad pages in the history of American valor were filled by these women, outwardly calm, their children romping after butterflies in a glory of sunshine, while horrid tales drifted in of deeds done by the masterless men in the forest just beyond the horizon. And far off the souls of their fathers, husbands, brothers, while they held grimly the lines of last defense. The buoyancy of the Southern temper withstood the shock of Gettysburg and was not overcome by the fall of Vicksburg. Of the far-reaching significance of the latter catastrophe, in particular, there was little immediate recognition. Even the Secretary of War in November reported that the communication with the Trans-Mississippi, while rendered somewhat precarious and insecure, is found by no means cut off or even seriously endangered. His report was the same sort of thing as those announcements of strategic retreats with which the world has since become familiar. He even went so far as to argue that on the whole, the South had gained rather than lost, that the control of the river was of no real value to the North, that the loss of Vicksburg has, on our side, liberated for general operations in the field a large army, while it requires the enemy to maintain cooped up, inactive, in positions, so their soldiers and their considerable detachments of their forces were tied down. He also attempted to reverse the facts to show that the importance of the Mississippi in commerce was a northern, not a southern concern. He threw light upon the tactics of the time by his description of the future action of Confederate sharpshooters who were to terrorize such commercial crews as might attempt to navigate the river. He also told how light batteries might move swiftly along the banks and at points commanding the channel, rain on the passing steamers unheralded destruction. He was silent upon the really serious matter, the patrol of the river by the Federal gunboats, which rendered commerce with the Trans-Mississippi all but impossible. This report, dated the 26th of November, gives a view of the war in Tennessee and enlarges upon that dreadful battle of Chickamauga, which ranks as one of the grandest victories of the war. But even as the report was signed, Bragg was in full retreat after his great disaster at Chattanooga. On the 30th of November, the administration at Richmond received from him a dispatch that closed with these words: "I deem it due to the cause and to myself to ask for relief from command and investigation into the causes of the defeat." In the middle of December, Joseph E. Johnson was appointed to succeed him. Whatever had been the illusion of the government, they were now at an end. There was no denying that the war had entered a new stage and that the odds were grimly against the South. Davis recognized the gravity of the situation, and in his message to Congress in December 1863, he admitted that the Trans-Mississippi was particularly isolated. This was indeed a great catastrophe, for hereafter neither men nor supplies could be drawn from the far southwest. Furthermore, the Confederacy had now lost its former precious advantage of using Mexico as a means of secret trade with Europe. These distressing events of the 4 months between Vicksburg and Chattanooga established also the semi-isolation of the middle region of the lower South. The two states of Mississippi and Alabama entered upon the most desperate chapter of their history. Neither in nor out of the Confederacy, neither protected by the Confederate lines, nor policed by the enemy, they were subject at once to the full rigor of the financial and military demands of the administration of Richmond, and to the full relentlessness of plundering raids from the North. Nowhere can the contrast between the warfare of that day and the best methods of our own time be observed more clearly than in this unhappy region. At the opening of 1864, the effective Confederate lines drew an irregular zigzag across the map from a point in northern Georgia not far below Chattanooga to Mobile. Though small Confederate commands still operated bravely west of this line, the whole of Mississippi and a large part of Alabama were beyond aid from Richmond. But the average man did not grasp the situation. When a region is dominated by a mobile army, the appearance of things to the civilian is deceptive. Because the powerful federal armies of the Southwest at the opening of 1864 were massed at strategic points from Tennessee to the Gulf and were not extended along an obvious trench line, every brave civilian would still keep up his hope and would still insist that the middle Gulf country was far from subjugation, that its defense against the invader had not become hopeless. Under such conditions, when the government at Richmond called upon the men of the Southwest to regard themselves as mere sources of supply, human and otherwise, mere feeders to a theater of war that did not include their homes, it was altogether natural that they should resist and resent the demand. All the tragic confusion that was destined in the course of the fateful year 1864 to paralyze the government at Richmond was already apparent in the Middle Gulf country when the year began. Chief among these was the inability of the state and Confederate governments to cooperate adequately in the business of conscription. The two powers were determined rivals, struggling each to seize the major part of the manhood of the community, while Richmond, looking on the situation with the eye of pure strategy, wished to draw together the full manpower of the South in one great unit. The local authorities were bent on retaining a large part of it for home defense.